Hello, friends! Welcome to this week's episode of New Mind Cafe. And this episode actually has a title called Biracial Brothers, which I'll get into a little bit more in a second. But speaking of brothers, I'm joined by my brother, Dillon Masaru.
No relation.
No relation. Yeah, obviously he's the older brother and I'm the younger bro. So if he starts giving me noogies...
Noogies and swirlies.
Noogies and swirlies. So, as you may or may not know, and for you I'm referring to the listener, Dillon and I are white and Japanese, come from a family of Japanese Americans. And for this conversation, I just had a few basic questions that we're going to go back and forth with, and we're just going to start from there and see where it goes, because I want to do as little setup as possible and kind of just jump in. And these questions honestly might not make sense until the end, but just enjoy the ride, because we are kind of going to a fun place with this. Go with me. It's like a movie. This is like Act 1. It's all getting set up. So we're going to go back and forth answering these questions. Why don't we just start and do like we each answer this one. So like growing up, when you started to think of yourself as racially speaking, because you sort of get this mirroring from culture, from parents, from yourself, how did you understand yourself? Because obviously when you're like 5 years old, you're probably just like, I'm just a kid, which was certainly the case for me. But as you started having that social awareness, how did you begin to understand yourself?
I think, you sent me and asked me these questions beforehand, and I was always kind of, with this particular, I think with the first two questions especially, I'm like, I think this sort of conversation obviously wasn't on my radar, and there wasn't much that there wasn't a lot of intentional conversation or sit down, this is who you are. Right. Especially from our parents or older people. Yeah. Of course, growing up in the church, there's always the notion of like, oh, you're a Christian. There's, I think, in a lot of ways, that piece of my identity came before my ethnic background
that makes
as a child
sense.
growing up. So that stuff, and even in the church that we grew up in, there was sort of a denial of your culture. To put aside anything, it's a whitewashing method, I think. But put aside even like your physicality, all these different things. Yeah. Because you're first and foremost a child of Christ. And so I think that disrupted a lot of my formation around this stuff from having to come back to it sooner. Yeah. But I was always confused around this.
I like that. Okay.
So which is why it's hard to answer that question.
Yeah. Like you knew that. Let me kind of phrase it this way and tell me if this resonates, because that totally resonated with me, what you said. You knew that there was something there, but you just didn't have that language to help you make sense of it. Yeah. Which I actually, maybe we'd both answer that question similarly, but also a little differently, because I know like a lot of pre-George Floyd... But also just like, especially the place we grew up in, Simi Valley is a very conservative town. Yeah. Anyways. Logic, like colorblindness, gets really seeped into the psyches of like the collective imagination. So when you start, I mean, I don't really need to break down why colorblind, saying you don't see color, is really problematic. But it definitely informed my self-understanding that I think if I was 10 years old and someone asked me like, oh, like I knew... Look, it's kind of a contradiction, because I knew I was Japanese American. Like, we talked about it. We spent time with our extended family. We had dear, close relationships with a lot of people. We celebrated Japanese New Year. We hung up the Boys' Day or Children's Day flags. And there was certainly, like, that was an unavoidable part of our lives. Yeah. But it was almost like it was relevant to an extent. But I know for me... Because of the way I look, I've been told by every biracial person I know that they don't see me as... They could tell I'm biracial, but generally I know to this day that when I'm in a white space that I'm perceived as a white person, and I certainly received that mirroring as a kid. Yeah. So I think it was like the double whammy of all of it, where I knew there was something different. Like I was like, not everyone celebrates Japanese New Year. Not everyone like makes sushi every year, and like I could tell you the first time I saw my dad cook salmon, there was some culture shock. And there's like a uniqueness to that eclectic experience.
Yeah, it was like Gollum from Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, what are you doing? Because that was just the way sushi was a big, is a whole thing. But you're right, it wasn't like it was really talked about. So let me like give you the next question then.
Well, I did have
go
further.
For it.
And something around that too. I was always a bit confused around my cultural identity growing up. But at the same, like people always told me I looked Mexican.
There's something,
or Hispanic. I had a lady who started speaking Persian to me. People thought I was Italian.
Yeah.
Only a few people knew I was Asian American. It was usually the people who were also biracial who were like, "You're probably Asian American."
Totally.
So. That was, and in some ways, I think a lot of my friends growing up were Hispanic and Latino, and so I grew up around a lot of that, and I felt like it made it easier for me to fit in with different groups of people.
Absolutely.
Except for not white people, which I kind of learned that more later on. But yeah, and then even growing up, I do know like I really looked up to other Asian American movie stars, like Jackie Chan was huge, and I knew I related and had some solidarity with him. I remember, I think it was in the early 2000s, there was like, everyone was obsessed with ninjas. And like, everyone wanted to be a ninja.
I do remember that. Three brothers.
Every Halloween, everyone dressed up and wanted to were like ninjas.
Everyone tried karate for a week and dropped out.
Yeah, for sure. But I always felt that on some level, because I was Japanese and we would spend time around our family, that I was like, I'm actually could be a ninja. Like that could be a part of my family's past, I wonder with my grandpa, like I wonder if he was a samurai.
I remember having similar thoughts, and then we found out recently that our great grandparents were rice farmers.
Yeah, and it turns out they were farmers, so which
was still cool in a different way. But I kind of want to put this mid conversation because the crazy thing is I related to like everything you said.
Yeah.
Mid conversation note of when we're talking about this stuff. I promise anyone who's listening, this conversation is by no means extensive. And also, I hope it's really clear, we're not making an attempt to speak for every single biracial person, because that experience is way too eclectic and diverse and insane to be able to do that. So I'm not trying to turn this into like my own representation project. But what I am trying to do is hopefully out of this space we're creating, by leaning into our own specific experience and the safety we've created as brothers, that there's something resonant that people could hear and feel from that experience, because it just isn't talked about, which I think is our experience, and I know for a lot of friends I have that are biracial, it was the same thing, that when it came up, it often came up in a painful experience of realizing like, I experienced the world uniquely through this. Whether that's an experience of rejection, of a microaggression, or racism, people start to get those experiences. And I really resonated. It's interesting how, like, even the way we look, because I think if I was being honest, leaning into myself, I can always tell if someone's biracial now. I have, like, that instinct, and I think I had it as a kid. But I'm kind of going to start the next question as I say this. Like, the next question is, how did we perceive one another? Because beneath everything, when I answer that question, I saw you as my brother. I didn't see you as much else than that. I mean, I knew you were biracial. I knew we were both Japanese. I didn't have the language to say Japanese American at the time. But I also sort of already knew that people perceived you as Hispanic. Like, I sort of knew that too. So it's interesting.
People call me, a few people also call me Taliban at different points.
Oh, see, things like that, where but need not go there. So, like, I sort of knew that, but the whole time I kind of knew who you were. And I think on some level I knew who I was too. It's just taken some years to access it. But I do really relate to, there's this sense of I could put myself in so many different spaces that other people couldn't.
Mm-hmm.
I never was able to master like the popular kids at school, which I think also happened to be white often. But I did feel this sense of like cultural flexibility in being able to go to our grandparents' house where we had a Mexican-American grandmother and a Japanese-American grandfather, going to Dad's parents who are white grandparents, going to friends' homes, like our closest friends growing up were like El Salvadorian, Ecuadorian, Mexican-American, being able to sort of code switch. But there was this, we were the commonality that we could sort of fit into different spaces, which I do remember that feeling. I didn't really have the language for it because I thought everyone's life was like that. But now I'm going like, oh shit, in Simi Valley, not everyone had a friend group of like El Salvadorian friends.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure.
That was a racial thing.
Yeah, and even to that point, a little bit in that first question too, and this is, I think, a part of my story even later on, but our pastor was Francis Chan.
Who's that?
I don't know. Who's that?
Some people might not know, so you might need to share who that is, though.
Well, he's a Chinese-American pastor, and he started a mega church called Cornerstone in Simi. Yeah. He wrote Crazy Love, all these different things. And there's a lot of issues with how he's done ministry. A lot of it comes down to, from my perspective at least, is he essentially became the white man. He became he became a pastor for white people. But even so, as an Asian-American kid growing up, like I recognize, oh wow, there's an element where having an Asian pastor, I think there was a sense of solidarity that I felt with him.
That's interesting,
then multiple people thought that our mom and him were married, which is like that's
where it gets weird.
Yeah, it gets super weird.
Yeah.
But even so, like there was a recognition that we're connected in some way, and so it helped me. For whatever reason, didn't feel like I was completely isolated. I didn't have any people to look up to.
Yeah.
But there were people like, oh, there's people and there's elements I can still take from.
So I love that point that you made, because I feel like with all of the topics we're like barely skimming under the depths of like how far we can really analyze these things and dissect
they're just kind of glossing over, like that could be a whole conversation.
Which is really the point of this. But I totally agree, because obviously with a name that big, like Francis Chan, very complicated.
Yeah.
With him being a prominent evangelical fundamentalist pastor, celebrity pastor, complicated, there's a total breakdown we can have there, but you're right to say there is a level of cultural mirroring that even if it wasn't spoken, it was unspoken, that was profoundly helpful. And also I'm realizing now his kids were all biracial. And there's like another thing, it's like, crap, I didn't even think about that. But you're totally right. I mean, the fact that people thought our mom and him were together, that's weird. But that's a whole nother conversation. So like, let me like give the question to you. It's interesting, maybe like the way we answer it is going to be identical, because I feel like all the things you said, I'm like, oh yeah, I'd say the same thing. How did you perceive me as like your younger brother, who obviously you knew we both had the same set of parents, same heritage, but I also, as we're kind of getting at, I experienced the world slightly different than you because of the way I look and the way others perceive me.
Yeah.
But I'm curious, did that affect how you perceive me? Like, how did you perceive me?
Yeah, well, I think, I would always perceive you as my brother. But when people would, I would say this, but then when other people would say this, especially when they would look at photos of us, and be like, oh, those are your brothers. Like, yeah, I'm like, that's Ian, that's myself, that's Myles. And like, they would say, oh, Myles, oh, he's like, he looks white. I'm like, yeah, he's...
Oh, people would say that? Wow.
Yeah. And then I would even say, like, oh, if you looked at us, you could identify Ian because he has disabilities, then there's me, and then Myles, he looks like the whiter one. Yeah. And so that was a way of, for me as a kid, distinguishing, oh, this is what's different about all of us.
Yeah, and it's, oh God, to get into that is so complicated. And I honestly don't really want to get into all of it here, which is what we're just skimming the surface, going back to that theme. But hearing that is so validating, because it's helpful for me to, I mean, it's helpful for anyone to have a sense of awareness of their body and their identity and what kind of impact they have when they step into a room. Because even if it's unspoken from others, I think in the subconscious you'll feel those things, and like, because people's assumptions shape reality. So if you're in a group with a collective assumption, it's going to have a strong impact on you, whether or not you could identify that or not. So like, to hear that is like, oh yeah, that totally makes sense as to why. But here, let me kind of...
had a big head, too.
Also had a big head.
Yeah,
in
so
many
that was
senses
another
of the
identifying
word.
feature, yeah.
But I will say, I don't want to, like, just talk about this in the light sense and not skip over some of the heavy. Because what happened for me as I grew into adulthood, that belief that I'm a white man became so internalized, and I think it became more internalized as I entered into like my late teens and early 20s, that I got to a point where I didn't even see mom as an Asian woman, or I didn't even see you. Like, I stopped seeing those things altogether because that socialization, that awareness became so internalized.
Which is probably different between us.
So different, and I will say part of the gift of leaning into this part of me, and also being aware of like having a white passing identity and the privileges that grants, and the pain it grants, because it gives both, is realizing that my story matters and the story of our ancestors matters. And as I lean into this, I'm kind of having these moments where it's like, oh shit, if I didn't do this work, these stories wouldn't continue. Like, we are part of the next generation that gets to continue this heritage that's been lost. And to completely push it away is to perpetuate this narrative that the ideal person is someone who's completely assimilated into whiteness. And I feel like in some way I sort of embodied the toxicity of that hope in some ways in my body. But I'm learning to like resist that and use my privilege in this body to stand in solidarity with others who have also experienced racism, and also not also racism, also homophobia, transphobia, genderphobia. I don't know if that's a thing, genderphobia, but patriarchy, all that stuff. It's giving me an awareness of understanding that there's other identities I don't fully understand, in the same way that not everyone's going to understand my identity, and I don't even understand my identity. But when I lean into it, it doesn't lead to more like me thinking I'm better. It actually has led to solidarity. But I might be spoiling. Reed, did you have some thoughts that came from that?
None that, because that's kind of the next bit of questions.
Yeah,
right?
It's just interesting that we, because of the way we look, there's a big part of ourselves, we experience the world differently. And it sounded like you had to become more aware earlier on than me. That's what I'm getting at. Because I was aware, but it just took me more time because of my skin suit, my meat suit that I'm in.
Well, I guess I was aware that, and you might be different, but I knew that I related more with Hispanics and Latinos, those people, than I did with white people.
Yeah.
I didn't feel like I had an in with white kids. And I could somewhat be like, I could be cool with them.
Yeah.
But in terms of like spending time going over to their house, hanging out and everything, I wasn't in. Yeah. So to speak. And I knew people of color who were in with those folks, but they always seemed foreign. They seemed foreign to me too. The people of color who had ins with white people.
Yeah. And that's the difference, is I was the person of, which I feel complicatedly, because I know externally I don't experience reality as a person of color because I pass as white, and that's just the reality. But I'll use that language. It's complicated. I'm not either nor, it's a both and. As a person of color, as a biracial person of color, I had an easier into whiteness. And isn't that interesting? Because we were born into the same family. In so many regards, we're like the same person.
Yeah.
Which can be scary, but we just had this different experience, which has meant leaning in has looked differently.
Yeah.
But I also relate with, now that I'm becoming aware, I'm like, oh yeah, I was closer. I mean, that's a whole nother conversation, but I relate with almost everything you said. I just wasn't mirrored by culture to be told I could relate with what you said.
Yeah, for sure.
And it takes time to untangle that. But because of the way you were mirrored, you had to become more aware earlier on.
I don't know if as a kid if I was necessarily aware of that per se. I think as an adult now I'm aware of those realities, but it was more just like it was invisibly just how I lived.
That totally makes
sense. And intuitively
sense.
Just how I lived my life.
And I think I had that too. I just had not harder, but different scripts to work with that I'm still kind of untangling from.
Yeah.
Because it's hard when you're still conditioned in certain ways by culture and by friends.
Yeah.
And it makes having friends that understand more important. But let's go to the last question. And
you didn't answer the second question though.
How did I see you?
Yeah.
Did you answer that question? I did. Not in a direct way, but yes, I did.
Okay.
Well, I liked what I said. It's okay. It's okay.
We can move on.
I saw you as my brother. I saw you as biracial, but I was also aware of other people saw you as Hispanic Latino. And I knew intuitively that you were perceived as less white than me. That'd be my answer, in short.
Yeah.
But let's go to the last question.
We can edit that out.
No, this is good. I like this. So the last question is a sensitive one, I know. But I'm saying this to me. And the last question is for both of us. Okay, so this is how we used to perceive ourselves and each other. What perception of yourself do you want to live into going forward? And when I ask that, I just want to give another disclaimer. Identities are complicated. Any sort of identity, whether it's racial, gendered, sexual identity, any of it, it's so damn complicated. So while these identities are real and affect our lives, our perceptions of them change. So it should be really clear that our answer today might look different than our answer in a few years. But I want to hold space for where we are today and where we want to go going forward. So how is your perception evolving, and what do you want to live into with that?
Yeah, well, I just, my meeting yesterday was, that I had a meeting yesterday. I was hanging with them and then I had to leave. But I was in a PAX cohort. It's Made for PAX, really great organization. Yeah. President Drew Jackson is part of the Center for Activision. Yeah. What is it?
For Action and Contemplation.
Action
and
a
poet, activist, pastor.
Yeah.
Cool.
He's the president of this organization. Oshita Moore, also a great gal. She's my spiritual director, is also the spiritual director of this organization. And the director of this is Latasha Ferguson, another great...
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, and then my cohort director in this fellowship is Jonathan Murillo.
Huh.
And it's social entrepreneurial track where we're learning how to develop organizations, and it's only for people of color. So there's not a white face in the Zoom chat, which is like just seeing all these different people and hearing their backgrounds has been really fun and exciting. And so I think it's exciting for me to be able to lean into that, and there's also just a like-mindedness, a curiosity with this group of people that I identify with and resonate with deeply. And so I think in a lot of ways if people ask me, I would say I'm a person of color, or I talk about that a lot more. And because, being multiracial, it is still confusing even to me, and even talking to people who've been in this journey of awareness longer than I am would also attest to that, it seems.
Yeah.
But then I also, I would identify as Japanese, Japanese and Danish American, because those were the cultures that both of our parents seemed to identify with the most. My dad being Danish American and my mom being Japanese American. And then I also work at a Chinese American church. And it's been, that whole section of my life has been working in, I think, predominantly whiter spaces in Simi Valley. It's different, where I felt like I was working there, but I was always on the outside of it, versus working in this church. And there's still an element where that we're different, obviously, but their younger kids refer to me as Uncle Dillon.
Aww.
Or I'll call so-and-so Auntie Bonnie or Auntie Les or Uncle Les. And so it feels, there's a lot of solidarity with that, where I'm working there, but it's different. It feels like I'm working in a lot of ways with my people. Even though we come from very different places. So that's been, I think those are huge parts of my identity, been a huge parts of my identity formation today.
That's helpful.
Yeah.
Yeah, I love all of what you said, and I think the word that probably I most resonated with is it's complicated. I think it doesn't need to be complicated, but because others don't really know where to place us, it creates conditions to feel like you're complicated. Which, one of my favorite quotes from a book I read recently, specifically about multiracial Asian Americans, is the author said, I think it's Shigematsu, but don't take my word on that because my Japanese is not great. But he said, while others perceive me as half, I know I am whole. Which I was like, damn, what a zinger. And I think in that note, like where I'm going with this, to answer that question is, a few months ago, I went on a honeymoon to Hawaii. And for context, I actually had one person who's multiracial, Chinese American, and another person who's white, but a resident of Hawaii. And I never talked about being biracial, she just knew I was. And they both told me, like, Myles, it's going to be really interesting for you going to Hawaii as a biracial Asian American, because as for those who don't know, Hapas, that's the slang used to describe mixed race Asians in Hawaii, and it has the highest density of multiracial Asians in the country. Just like if you grow up there, I have a friend who grew up there biracial, and his sense of like identity was so different than mine because it's the norm and it's talked about. And so, and they said, yeah, like one person even told me people are probably going to see you as a local when you go in. And for context, I'm married to a white person, so it's like, wow, this is weird. I kind of heard them, but I didn't really believe them per se. I was just like, oh, interesting. I don't know. We'll see. But I went, and they were totally right. And it's hard to put words to, but I had this feeling there of just being seen and safe. Not necessarily in the touristy parts, but more in these other parts of Hawaii. It just felt like I could breathe. There was a part of me that could breathe for the first time. And I paid a lot of attention because I saw a lot of multi-ethnic families, especially a lot of like white Asian families. And it wasn't so going on in my conscious brain, but I knew like in my unconscious something was like paying attention. I didn't have language for it. What happened is I went there, I got back to the mainland, to my home, and I had this moment a few weeks after Hawaii where I looked at the mirror, and for the first time in my whole life, I made sense to me. I no longer was like looking in the mirror and confused at what I saw. Which, if I could re-answer the first question, that was how I saw myself growing up. Is if I was really being honest, I would look in the mirror and I wouldn't know where to place myself. Because I knew that other people couldn't, if they were being honest, but the only way they could is by identifying me as white. But there was always a little bit of identity confusion. But what happened is, coming back, something about just seeing it, the experience made sense. And it was the first time I made sense. And I wish I could live in that place 24/7.
Yeah.
But it's more like I have
who doesn't? It's Hawaii.
Right, yeah. Right? I wish I could live in that place of integration 24/7. But it's more like I have that now, and it makes the mirroring of deintegration more painful and confusing.
Yeah.
But as I'm growing to understand myself and what that means, is I'm not white, I'm not Asian, I'm both. And when you're biracial, you're part of both wholes, but you're creating a new whole by being who you are. Like it's a whole new construct all entirely. And that's sort of it. Like I don't fully understand what it means. I know something happened there. Or even, like I'll say, the way that I relate to people of color has changed. where there was a point when I was doing this work of like leaning into this, where all this racism that had been internalized started like coming to the surface, and I had a hard time even knowing how to interact with people of color anymore because I felt so confused. But even since that moment, something shifted, where it's almost like, I'll just say this, because I feel like I'm trying to put language to something that's languageless, but it was the moment that I was able to finally accept myself, moved me forward in helping me to accept others. Interesting how that works.
Mm-hmm.
But these moments in a culture that tells us our experience is invalid, which is painful, help me to realize my experience is definitely valid. And Dillon, I just wanted to thank you for doing this with me, because it was definitely helpful for me to talk to you about this in this form.
Yeah, likewise.
And I want to say for listeners, like, again, how do you say this? It's like, don't take our words to the bank. Listen to what we're saying, but know that there's probably a lot that we're talking about that we don't talk about in podcast form because we don't want to. And just know that we're really just skimming the surface of something that is our experience of life and is real, but is not all of us. Dillon's also a dungeon master and a bully.
You didn't have to say that.
And a real piece of work.
You really have to preface Dungeon Master.
Oh gosh.
you have to. Dungeons and Dragons is a tabletop game.
Nothing pornographic going on.
Nothing pornographic. It's not a BDSM thing. It's a fun game for children / adults, child adults.
But all I'm trying
man-childs, women-childs, all the childs. And if you feel it's like a child at heart, you can play that game.
Let my caffeinated brain take this from silly to serious again. But identities are so damn complex. We can be multiple things at once. And I think the danger of like talking about someone's experience as a particular identity is people will hear that and try to pin that person down and go like, oh, look I can only see you as this half Asian person now. Like, look at this person. It's like, no, look, we can be so many different things at once. Our brains are just too small to take it all in. We are humans are so complicated, so complex. But these racial experiences that we get socialized in and our heritages inform our identities. Who knew?
Wow.
Whoa, who knew?
Who knew?
But again, Dillon, thank you for doing this.
Yeah.
I've had a lot of fun, and it's been more helpful than you can know in continuing the work.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah. And if you ever want to know anything about dungeon mastering,
check out my podcast.
Yeah. Check out your OnlyFans. I'm kidding. Maybe you shouldn't joke about that here.
It's
it's a whole thing. That's another podcast episode for another time. But
that's right.
Listeners, thank you for joining us in our brotherly, biracially conversation. And I want to send love and gratitude as you continue your days and weeks. Until next time. Bye.
Thank you all so much for listening to this New Mind Cafe podcast. We really appreciate your support with this journey of exploring creative people and getting inspired by many different art forms. If you enjoyed the music on this episode, well, that was all original work by me, and if you want to hear more original music, you can check out our band called New Mind Collective. When I'm not working on music or podcast episodes, I'm working on the other component of my small business, which is roasting coffee. So if you want to follow along all of what my business New Mind Cafe is doing in the coffee and the arts industries, then please check out our website at www.neumindcafe.com. On there you'll find upcoming events, gigs, podcast episodes, music, products, and all the links to the social media and platforms to stream music. If you are enjoying this podcast, please like, subscribe, leave a rating, or comment wherever you're hearing this podcast. And please, please, please share this with others. We are trying to spread the word about what we are doing, and we want to include others in this as well. So if you or someone you know is creative and wants to share, then please email us at neumindcafe@gmail.com. Thank you all again and have such a great day.